San Francisco Fed President John Williams has been picked to run the central bank's powerful New York branch, replacing Bill Dudley, or William Dudley. Williams is a respected monetary economist, but his appointment has sparked some controversy. Joining us from Washington is Dennis Kelleher, President and CEO of Better Markets. Dennis, great to have you with us. Just how frustrated are you by this decision?
Well, I think we had a flawed process that unfortunately did not take sufficient account of the interest of the broad American people. We had a unique circumstance to some extent because we have a new chair of the Fed, Jay Powell, who is not an economist and does not have a long history with monetary policy. So what he's trying to do is build a strong bench that focuses largely on having deep Fed knowledge and economist knowledge and monetary policy knowledge. But the head of the Fed is also the primary supervisor of the biggest, most dangerous banks in the United States and indeed the world. And he should be reflecting the diversity of the country, and not just in terms of gender and ethnicity, but also diversity of thought. One of the key flaws of the Fed over the last several decades has been groupthink, which has caused them to miss significant economic shifts from the dot-com bubble to the housing bubble. And so what we really need is much more diversity and more strength of character and courageous people who will actually argue for independence and independence of thought. And we didn't see a process here that we felt actually established that.
So, Dennis, when you have someone like Janet Yellen coming out and praising the pick here of Williams, rather than reassuring you, judging by what you're saying, it does exactly the opposite, that the idea of continuity at the Fed is not necessarily a good thing.
Well, Julie, to be fair, I think that Janet Yellen's endorsement of Mr. Williams goes a very long way. I think Janet Yellen will go down in history as one of the great Fed presidents on the merits across the board. And it means quite a bit that she is endorsing Mr. Williams. What I'm really talking about is a process, though. And while Mr. Williams is a recognized monetary policy expert and a stellar economist, he's also somebody who has demonstrated experience not only throughout the Fed, but managing incredibly large institutions. And let's not forget, the New York Fed is a very large, important institution that needs to be managed by somebody who's done that before. But what we need, and what the Fed needs, is credibility with the American people. And one of the ways to get credibility with the American people is have more transparency and more accountability, and have a process that's open, and so that the American people see that that process includes the diversity of the country. There are 320 million Americans. It's not credible to say that out of 320 million Americans, we only have a couple who are qualified for this job. There are many more people qualified for this job, and they need to be looked at. And there's an opportunity now, both by Mr. Williams at the New York Fed and by the Fed, because the San Francisco Fed president position is now open, and Mr. Williams has to start off in New York demonstrating that what has been said about him in terms of diversity of thought and diversity of input, he should, for example, start thinking about creating committees that are permanent committees that meet a couple of times a year, that are people from outside the Fed who he will listen to, use as sounding boards and brainstorm with. Similarly, the process that they're now going to put in place to replace the San Francisco Fed president they ought to take it as a challenge to make it a model process that's transparent and accountable to the American people, that produces the diversity that they talk about.
Dennis, I mean, you've chucked so much at us there, whether it's transparency of process, whether it's the regulatory aspect here. You talked about strength of character. You also talked about diversity and representing the U.S. People better in terms of the approach. Is it the fact that he's a white male that upsets you the most here?
Well, not me. I mean, truthfully, what you want is the best qualified person to do the job. But too much of the problem historically has been that the pool that people look in, where the presumption is where the quality is, doesn't actually reflect the diversity of the country, and actually doesn't reflect the diversity, I mean, the quality of the country. And so whether you're a white male, a black man, a black woman, you name it, the real issue is cast the net wide side, look at all the qualities that are needed. And it's not just monetary policy, although that's important, but it's also the ability to think independently, to avoid the debilitating groupthink that has too often led the Fed and the policymaking in the wrong direction at the critically wrong time. I mean, you know, the 2008 financial crisis was a shock to the Fed long before it was a shock to the country, and it shouldn't have been shocked. And I think a diversity of opinion that comes from the diversity of the country is one of the best ways to guard against that.
Yeah, I know if Scarlett were here, she'd have one or two things to say about that. So thank you so much.
Dennis Kelleher, President and CEO of Better Markets. Appreciate it. We'll have more on Amazon next. This is Bloomberg.